Well, we've all heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which most of us likely associate with combat veterans. But today's guest says that first responders are also at a high risk of PTSD. Norm Wielsch joins us from the San Francisco Bay Area. He was a police officer for 25 years, part of which he was an undercover narcotic agent. But after a series of difficult life events, ended up in federal prison, where he, interestingly enough, studied to earn a doctorate in Christian counseling. Norm is the author of Christ-Centered Healing of Trauma, Healing a Broken Heart. Norm, welcome to Bridge City News and Miracle Channel. So great to have you on today.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored.
Oh, great. Well, Norm, okay, so you have quite a story to tell here. So can you maybe give our viewers a brief snapshot of your life story, of the events that led up to writing this book?
Oh gosh, it's a long story, but I'm going to try to make it short. As a police officer, as all police officers throughout the whole world experience many traumas. I mean, everything from horrific suicides to children's death and horrible accidents and murders. It's just sometimes it's overwhelming. And I grew up in a middle class neighborhood, and I never really experienced death, and that was my first bout with death, and it was difficult for me. Yet my father was in the military, and he always taught me to just push down your emotions, right? Just to keep them down and move forward. Men don't cry. Just go to the next thing, and that's what the police academy taught too. And like my first serious call, which was about a couple months in, was a airplane crash. It crashed right into a shopping mall through the ceiling, and it was on December 23rd, and it was 50 yards away from where Santa was talking to the children.
Oh my gosh.
And there was 14 deaths and 88 injured. It was a horrific scene. And so police, and I'm not trying to say I experienced all this. This is what police officers experience every day.
Yeah.
And unless we're really prepared for it, it can really have a negative effect on our lives, because they want us to just move forward. So after you leave that plane crash, you go right to another call. Maybe it's a residential burglary, and you have to be nice to the people. And after all these things you just saw, and
Wow.
I did it well. I don't know why I did it well, but it wasn't until about 14, 15 years later when it all came bubbling out.
I'm surprised it took that long. That's crazy, because you don't have time to even process anything.
No, no, you don't. And now I understand police departments are doing a lot more to help this. In other words, once you experience a traumatic event, they kind of do a debriefing and stuff. But back old school, no, you just went from one call to another, and your sergeant was there to say, hey, you just got to go to the next call, because we just don't have anybody else to do it. And I believe now that it's changing, but it's a slow change. I still talk to some of the guys that are working, and they say it's still not happening. But more and more departments are getting chaplains, which is great. I think a chaplain in each police department, fire department, hospital, any first responder agency is going to help them process these things they see.
Okay, so you had PTSD, and at some point you became addicted to prescription pain medication, right? Because of
Yeah, as soon as I left the police department, went to state narcotics, I was diagnosed with a incurable disease, which is Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, which is compounded by peripheral neuropathy. Now, I'm not a diabetic, but peripheral neuropathy, you lose your feeling in your feet and your hands. And the Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease is you lose muscle mass in your hands and feet. And what would happen is on the bottom of my feet would become large ulcers, and they just wouldn't heal because you're constantly putting pressure on your feet. So they would have to cast them up, and then I have to go to work, or I have to be off work. And pretty soon they started doing surgeries. I had 30 surgeries in a 10-year period. And even though I didn't have any feeling in my feet, they continued to give me opioids. In other words, Percocet,
right.
Vicodin, Oxy, for the pain. And I'm not blaming the doctors, because the doctors have an obligation to reduce the pain. But what I noticed for me is that it kind of evened out my panic attacks and anxiety attacks and PTSD. In other words, where I was starting to get a panic attack. If I took a couple pills, it would level it out. In other words, I was numbing my emotions. That's what I was doing. I was not letting myself feel those emotions in order to process them. I was just numbing them with the pills. And I think that's what we tend to do when we don't want to deal with things, either with alcohol, with pills. Some people use illegal substances to do that with. But in your mind, you're thinking, this is a legal pill, right? This is prescription. I'm not doing anything wrong. But the more you do it, the more and more pills you take. And I truly, after about 4 years of that, I really became addicted. And even though I was a working addict, I mean, I was a commander of a narcotic task force, and I was still doing my job, but I really wasn't fit for duty. But you see, it's police have this. I shouldn't say police. First responders have this warrior mentality where you don't admit defeat. You don't admit that there's anything wrong with you. And the culture is such that if I were to have gone to my supervisor and said, I need to see a psychologist, sure, they would have set me up with a psychologist. But the next thing they would have done is take my badge and gone away and put me off duty. And then once you're considered weak by your coworkers, you will never be trusted again. They will never accept you again. And I'm a big guy, and I was always part of that, tough guy mentality, and that's
Yeah,
how we grew up through the ranks.
right. And it's such a
But it's
boys'
just
club
not
too.
healthy.
Yeah, definitely. So what landed you in prison, and how did you have this awakening?
Well, after my arrest, what I did is I actually ended up stealing some drugs out of evidence, and I got a 14-year prison sentence. While I was out on bail, God intervened in my life. It was just crazy. I was sitting home one night with my wife. I got this phone call, and the phone call was Jeff Kenny, who's a pastor of a church down here in the Bay Area near San Francisco. And he said, "Hey, I heard about what would happen, and I want to help. I want to invite you to my church. We have counseling." And to be honest, I didn't believe in God. I was more of agnostic, I think, where I just wasn't sure because of all the horrible things I've seen and witnessed. I really couldn't believe there was a true God that loved you when these horrible things happen, right? But I didn't know anything about God. Anyway, I kind of tried to blow him off a little bit. And he said, "Well, come to my church anytime, but can I pray for you?" So I said, "Sure." He prayed the sinner's prayer, and I didn't know at that time what the sinner's prayer is. And when he said, "Hey, do you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior?" I said, "Yeah." I really didn't understand what I was saying, but I just said, "Yeah." I think it was more to appease him. So we hung up. I went back to and sat on the couch, and it was the strangest thing. It felt like a weight was off my shoulders. And my wife, she'd been grown up Christian, but she didn't express her views because I didn't believe, right? So we ended up going to church. It was a phenomenal experience. And just before that, I'm sorry, I got to backtrack, but before my arrest, the last straw was my daughter got these tumors on her liver,
Oh,
and she is a direct DNA match with me. And the doctors told us that she needed the surgery, that there was only be a 50% survival of the surgery. And that was kind of the last straw that really led me down. And I attempted suicide 2 times, and thank God, I think that God stopped it. But so when I'm out on bail and I'm going to church, I'm dealing with my daughter's illness too. She was 24 at the time. And one day the pastor just stopped on Sunday sermon. He just stopped, and he had the whole congregation pray for my daughter for her healing. And about a week later, she went to a biopsy, and we did the biopsy. About 2 weeks later, we went to the doctor, and the doctor showed us the slides and everything. There were no tumors left. She had been healed. The doctor couldn't explain it. And that was the point right there where I believe God is there. He's a healing God. He's a loving God. And I was just on fire from there on out. So that's when I went to prison. And God, God has a plan. He sent me to Fort Worth, Texas, and that was so far away from home, from the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was really upset that I was so far away from my family. But in prison, they had a seminary. Tyndale Seminary came in and they did seminary classes. And so I got a job at the chapel. I started studying. I learned how God works and God's the biblical principles. And so I got my master's degree in theology and counseling. And then I went on and continued into a doctorate in Christian counseling. And that's when I learned how God heals, right? There's basic principles in the Bible of confession, repentance, and sanctification that leads to your healing. And once I started doing that, and I was working with another ex LAPD officer who was severely had severe PTSD, and I was healed in about 4 or 5 months. And this entire time, these 3 years prior to that, I was going to psychologists, and there was no healing from. They showed me how to cope, and there is a place for psychologists, psychiatrists. I'm not saying there is no place for them, but there was no healing. They really taught me how to cope. And it was then in prison where I believe God healed me. I haven't had a PTSD symptom now in, I guess, 11 years.
Wow. Your story is so incredible, your testimony, and there's so many different directions we can go with this
Yeah.
interview. But I know that you write that first responders are they're very susceptible to PTSD, and I can see why. And you're also saying that it's very common that they get addicted to drugs and alcohol just as a way to cope. So do you have any suggestions to mitigate the onset of PTSD? And maybe what are some of the signs and symptoms somebody could be dealing with it and maybe not realizing it?
Yeah, it really comes on quickly. I never realized I had it. I mean, I felt depressed and I felt all these symptoms, but I didn't put it all together. Because of the police academy, they only have like a 3 hour block on, good eating and exercise. But the biggest thing, by looking back now, the biggest thing that I see is that all first responders, they they live it, it's not a job, right? It's hard to explain. It's not a job, it's an identity, right? And once you lose that identity, either through an illness, possible firing or retirement, you're no longer a first responder. You're just a normal person, and that is devastating to law enforcement and first responders. My other mistake I made was I got rid of all my old friends. I used to race cars, and I had a whole bunch of friends, and one by one, I just pushed them away because, one would maybe smoke marijuana, the other one got a DUI. And in police work, we're really black and white, right? Either you're a good guy or you're a bad guy. And even if you just, it's a faulty way of thinking. I'm going to admit that right now. But back then, if you had like sleeved up tattoos, you're a bad guy. If you had a DUI, you're a bad guy. So I slowly kicked away all my friends and was only hanging out with police officers. And that's really bad because I believe that outside friends of the outside the industry will keep you grounded, you know? And then the third thing I learned that I think was a huge mistake that I hope other officers and first responders learn is that we need to be open and honest with our families. I mean, you don't have to go home and say, yeah, today was a bad day, honey. I saw this good decapitated guy today. No, no, no. But I think that they're strong enough to deal with the things. So when I came home and how was you? Oh, it's all right, but it was like what the stuff I saw was horrific, but I just kept it inside. Yeah, I think we need to trust our families to be a little bit more open and honest. And if you are feeling bad, talk to somebody. If it's not your family, it's a close friend. And if it can't be a close friend, somebody in the church. And if you don't go to church, go to a psychologist. It doesn't have to be through the police department. It could be on your own because we need to let this out, right? We can't just keep holding this stuff in. And those are the three main things that I've learned by looking back to the mistakes that I made by not opening up to people.
Definitely. You also write in your book that it's important for first responders to have some sort of a faith as well. Like, does that help?
See, I believe it does, right? Because if you don't believe in a higher power, I'm going to call mine a Christian God. But if you don't believe in a higher power, there's no rhyme or reason to life, right? Life is just a series of incidents that happen. But if you truly believe that there is a higher power and there's a reason for things that happened, I believe that you can adjust to it and cope with it a little bit better, saying, okay, I understand that this happened. There's a reason for it. I don't know the reason. I'll probably never learn the reason. I don't know why I got this disease. I might never learn it, but when I'm in heaven, I truly believe that God will say, "Hey, I used this for this and this and this." You know, God uses broken people, and I think that's a real important thing to understand. Is that if you're going through a trial, belief in God will make that trial for a purpose, right? There's just no, why am I going through this? Or God, why me? Why me? And that's what I did a lot was God, why me? Even though I wasn't a believer, I still said, God, why me? But now I see it, right? I look back and I see, okay, the pain that I went through, the poor decisions that I made, God allowed me to make, but it was a learning process, right? And now having been there and done that, I can counsel people. I'm an addiction counselor right now, and I'm a chaplain. So I can help others because I've been there and done that. And I think that's why having a belief in a higher power is so important because it makes sense of the things in life.
That's incredible. Your story is just amazing. Thanks so much for sharing it with us today, Norm.
Oh, thank you for allowing me to.
Norm Wielsch is the author of Christ-Centered Healing of Trauma, Healing a Broken Heart. It was so great to have him on today. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.